Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hopkins at Home. Um, my name is Luis Quintero. I'm a faculty member, an assistant professor at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins. And I'm very excited to give this lecture of a very relevant topic that is in the top of our heads right now. I would like to thank all the people from Hopkins at Home and in general to everyone in the development and alumni relations for this initiative. I think it is great. We're going to be doing a lecture for about 45 minutes. We're going to have time to stop for urgent clarifying questions, but overall, feel free to use the Q&A function during the lecture, and we will have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the lecture to address longer, more analytical questions. So let's start this discussion thinking about the description of a crisis, right? So think about it almost as the beginning of a movie. And so the movie starts with the words, "There's a crisis looming. It affects the whole world. No individual or country alone can address this crisis. We need to be together in it. It's a crisis that can affect our health, our livelihoods, and even though there is relative scientific consensus about how to prevent it from growing, the short-run economic cost stalls decisive action." What am I talking about, right? So probably the first thing that came to your mind was COVID-19. That's what we talk about all the time. That's a big crisis. However, I could have been talking about climate change as well, right? They both crises check all the points that I just mentioned, right? And so this is what we're going to be exploring today a little bit, right? COVID-19 and climate change. This is going to be a lecture that probably will give you more questions than answers, but what we're going to do is explore how COVID-19 and climate change are similar in many ways, how they are directly connected, how the pandemic can change the prospects of our abilities to become more sustainable and addressing the threat of irreversible damage to our climate in the future, right? So I think I'm going to address those in order through these three different sets of questions. First, we're going to look at similarities and differences, then how COVID-19 is directly affecting climate change, and how, I think much more importantly, it can affect our fight going forward against climate change. All right, so first thing, how are these two related? How are they similar? Well, they are terrible crises. They are deadly and costly crises, right? So if we look at the worldwide numbers, so far we have a death toll of around more than 100,000 already in the United States, which is a third of the total death toll of 356,000 in the world. It is affecting everyone, and it's also creating a big impact in the economy. However, let's look at climate change, right? So the numbers for deaths related to climate change are a little bit lower if we look at the previous years, but most simulations and forecasts predict that between 2030 and 2050, we could have 250,000 additional deaths each year just from factors like malnutrition, heat stress, and malaria associated with climate change, right? So in all senses, both are terrible tragedies. These are, the first thing that they share in common. These are things that are deadly, that destroy economies and destroy lives. On one side, climate change affects and has been affecting the economy and destroying infrastructure, right? So from the data reported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we can see a large growth in disaster event types that represent damages of $1 billion or more, right? Looking at the data from 1980, they're constantly increasing, including floodings, wildfires, droughts, severe storms, all kinds, right? Those are associated with increases in poverty in some locations. And climate change is forecasted by the World Bank to force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. So a lot of the gains that we have made as a society in reduction of poverty could be wiped out or partially wiped out by climate change. In a recent article published in Science, Xiang and co-authors looked at the economic damage expected by county, right? So even though we are throwing out numbers for the world and for countries, this is not uniform, right? This crisis is not affecting everyone equally. So here we can see that the coastal areas are going to be much more affected. And overall, you can see impacts on percentage of GDP annually, a little bit less than 100 years from now, of 20, 25, up to 30%, right? So very big numbers. Now, we've also heard everywhere, of course, about the big impact on the economy that COVID-19 has had, right? So what are the magnitudes? The magnitudes are pretty similar to what we expect to see some decades from now. And for example, according to the IMF, many economies might suffer contractions. Here we see some of the main developed economies. And for 2020, the forecast is, declines of 5%, 10%, the US is looking at 7%. So, these are significant declines, big recessions, declines that are greater than the around 2.53% that the US saw in the Great Recession. We also expect the rebound to be faster and stronger because this is a very particular crisis. It's people staying at home, and then we expect that the economy might recover a little bit faster. So as you can see, the forecasts for 2021 are all also stronger growth levels than you would see the year after the worst moment of the recession in the Great Recession. There's many ways of looking at this besides the forecast, right? We can look at high frequency data. This data that I'm showing you here, we have two lines, one for the total number of COVID-19 cases in the US. The other one is for the aggregate number of visits that people are making in the US, right? So this should be understood as a measurement of mobility. This comes from a recent paper that I've been working on with my colleagues at the Carey Business School, where we're looking at what is the impact of stay-at-home orders on local economies and the spillover on nearby economies, right? But here, the message of this graph is that there is approximately a 50% decline in the amount of people who are moving around. Starting in March 10, which was the stock market crash, and one of the first dates where the number of cases really start picking up. Right? There's heterogeneity across geographies, but if you look at all of the states in the U.S., the median state has seen its traffic decline by more than 40%, and some of them go all the way up to 70 and 60%. Right? So this is an unprecedented crisis, and these numbers are important because they are correlated with economic activity. So this is showing the extent of this crisis and the effect on economic activity. There's other ways of looking at it, right? This graph that I'm showing you here is showing you the claims for unemployment. It's been the 8th week in a row that the number of initial claims, since the number of initial claims was in the million, the numbers have decreased a little bit from the peak that we had at the end of March, which was 6.9 million, unprecedented. As you can see, the data goes back, but I could keep moving it back almost to the Great Depression. But we're rebounding. It's getting a little bit better, but the scale is very big. Here, I'm only focusing on Louisiana, right? And I see the thing that I wanted to point out is that the number of unemployment claims during Hurricane Katrina are similar to the number of unemployment claims during COVID-19, right? So again, we're making parallels, drawing, parallels between these two crises. And this is telling us, climate change, which is, one of the causes of large scale disasters, climate related events like Hurricane Katrina, every time one of these disasters happens is as if we had a COVID-19, at least in the locations where it happens, right? So that's another connection right there. And then finally, just to show you, we're a little bit pessimistic at the beginning of this lecture, but I promise we will become a little bit more optimistic as we move on. And this is looking specifically specifically at payroll deposits on credit cards and debit cards. This is also from a current working paper I'm working on with people at the Carey Business School and IMF economists. And what this shows is the distribution of the change in the amount of payments comparing the first 2 weeks in March and the last 2 weeks in April for restaurant workers. We find that a lot more workers in the restaurant business are losing income as would be expected in 2020. Yeah. And the interesting message here is that complements the analysis of the unemployment claims is that it's not only who become unemployed that lose money, it's also those that work part-time and work by hours that are losing, not necessarily 100, but between 75 and 50% of their income, 50 and 25, 25 and 0, right? So there's losses happening. This specifically is an industry that has been really, really hard hit. All right, the other thing that I wanted the other similarity that I think is important is this issue of collective action, right? So what do you see in this picture? There's a woman practicing Tai Chi, right? This picture was taken before COVID-19, so the face mask is probably more related to pollution. And here the pollution is a negative externality. People driving around and factories producing goods pollute the air. It might affect them, but only partially. And as a consequence, these agents do not internalize all of the costs of their pollution. That's why we have a negative externality, right? So one thing we know is that the decentralized or market solution, meaning the situation that we reach when individuals decide separately in the presence of externalities, will produce more of the good or activity that is producing that negative externality than would be socially optimal, right? So in other words, the factories are producing this pollution, this negative impact, and they're not bearing all the costs of these negative actions they're doing. Right? The other way of looking at this is why isn't this person, maybe this person when they go home, they still drive their car, they still use a lot of electricity associated with growth in emissions. Why aren't they just changing their behavior? And the issue here, it's again externalities. If you, instead of driving to your work, start using your bicycle, then you are contributing to society by imposing a positive externality by reducing emissions, but you're bearing the whole cost of being, sweaty and tired and breathing everybody else's smoke, right? So what happens here is that when the benefits are widespread and the costs are individual, or when the costs are widespread and the benefits are individual, then usually we need regulations to solve the problems optimally. And this is what happens in both of these crises, right? If we walked around with our own, spaceman suit, where we could decide whether we pollute our own air or not, there wouldn't be a problem, right? You can decide optimally whether you want to pollute your own air or make your own habitat warmer or colder. The problem is, in this case, that this is not the case, right? We are victims of other people's actions, and because they do not bear the whole cost of their actions, then they tend to not internalize it. The same thing happens with COVID-19, right? So I think everyone has seen these pictures of large crowds that visited Florida at the beginning of the year when the effects of the pandemic were already strong. And people were asked, why do you go out? And they said, well, I don't really worry that much about it. There's also an age difference in the morbidity and mortality rate. So they didn't worry that much. And, as an economist, I would think that's not so much of a problem unless we have externalities. And again, we have externalities in COVID-19, which are the ability or the probability of infecting others. Right? So because you can infect others, and will most likely do, increasing your own probabilities of being infected is affecting society at large. Again, these two problems share something that makes them really hard to solve unless we come up with a centralized solution. We require coordination because the actions of a few affect the large majority of people. Again, if you could walk around completely isolated in COVID-19, then maybe, you should be allowed to decide the risks that you're incurring, but that is not the case. right? So this idea of benefits being universal and costs being individual is something that has been used to explain why some countries, for example, have joined climate agreements like the Paris Agreement, and others haven't. Right. So let's think about a very simple situation. We have an example where the rest of the world is negotiating as a bloc, and is negotiating with the U.S. whether they want to join or not an agreement. Right. So if you look at the little table down here, I don't know if you're familiar, you've ever taken game theory, you're probably familiar with it, but you don't need to understand what this is showing. This is showing the net benefits you're getting from joining or not joining the agreement, conditional on others doing it, right? So let's say the benefits for the rest of the world of joining the agreement are 4, and the costs are 1.5. So 4 minus 1.5 would be the net benefits of joining the agreement. And the same thing for the US. The crucial thing here in this analysis is that when the rest of the world joins the agreement, and because they are in charge of 3/4 of the emissions, and so let's normalize the total emissions at 4, because they're responsible for reducing the emissions by 3, when they join the agreement, right, the upper row here, and the US opts out, the US is still receiving the benefits of others joining the agreement. That's the whole collective action externality discussion that I'm trying to give, right? So when you calculate this and calculate what we call the Nash equilibrium, you will find that is in the benefit of the US to actually reap those benefits of not joining, right? They're getting the same benefits and they're not really joining. That is similar to, a young person reaping the benefits of going outside and not really incurring in the costs of getting sick and making others sick. All right. So the same could be said, for example, of countries imposing stay-at-home orders. The rest of the countries in the world benefit from China, for example, imposing lockdowns during the pandemic. And China benefits from the other countries doing the same. However, the fact that the benefits are shared and the costs are individual means we have externalities, and we could end up with fewer countries imposing lockdowns than would be optimal. Right? One thing that I find interesting here is that this issue of externalities is very salient in climate change, in the sense that there's a few countries, and you can see them, it's usually the rich industrialized countries that are producing, in general, not all of them, but that would be a generality. They're the ones that are producing the highest levels of emissions. However, the costs are borne by the whole world, right? So again, we have this issue that the benefits are private, the costs are public, and this is similarly with COVID-19. In COVID-19, there's actually a lot more widespread than when you look at the map of emissions. But again, we have this issue that we individually or as countries have an incentive to do what's better for us, even if we impose costs on others. And that makes these crises very difficult to address in both cases. And finally, another thing that is very similar between climate change and COVID-19 is the political bias, right? This poll that I'm showing you here in April 2019 shows a strong political divide on the perception of what should be done to address climate change. And to complicate things further, there are also biases about the perception of whether climate change is a problem that exists at all or not, right? And similar issues of crisis denial were observed at the beginning of the COVID-19. The differences are not so extreme, but we still see different perceptions of how bad the COVID-19 crisis is across different political leanings. And correspondingly about how much should be sacrificed in terms of resources to address it, right? If you are you lean more liberal, then you are more willing to implement policies that could have economic costs to address the crisis. In all policies implemented, except for, not surprisingly, the restrictions to foreign travel, liberals showed, for example, strong support, right? So not only we have, so I want to summarize these things that they have in common, right? On one end, they're very big, large scale, deadly, very costly to the economy. Second point, they suffer from this issue that the benefits of costly actions are widespread across the population of the world. Climate change, probably a little bit more. And in the third point that makes it very difficult to address is that it has been politicized, both issues. And so they both, the problems that we've had in addressing climate change is something that we could learn about how to address COVID-19. All right, now, how are they different? I've been telling you a little bit about how they're similar. One way in which they are different is the saliency, right? COVID-19 has become extremely salient, especially when compared to climate change. COVID-19 is everywhere in the media, in our conversations, in our pop culture, right? And so this meme is kind of funny, but true, where climate change needs to hire coronavirus publicists. The saliency has been reflected in the way media covers it. Climate change, for example, just occupied 0.7% of the total air coverage in 2019, despite 2019 being the second hottest year in 140-year climate record, just behind 2016, as reported by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So it's not like it wasn't a problematic year. It was a very problematic year. NASA also reported that the decade of 2010 to 2019 was the hottest decade ever recorded, and still, no real coverage in the news. The same happened, for example, in this results of a survey in Australia, where climate-related events last year, like bushfires, created environmental and political chaos, and still the coverage in the media remains much lower than COVID-19. Right? So that makes these two crises quite different. How much people are talking about it, how much they are in the media. And that is reflected in the policy reaction, right? The map shows that by the end of March, most states in the US had issued statewide stay-at-home orders, right? So it's a very strong reaction. We saw that those orders were associated with a decline of approximately 50% of people's movements. And despite some critics wanting an earlier and more aggressive response, I might count myself in those, but the policy reaction has been unprecedented, especially when compared to climate change, right? Here, another interesting thing is that people started reacting to COVID-19 individually, privately, independently, even before these stay-at-home orders were put in place. So this graph that I'm showing you here is also from this work we're doing with mobile phone data, and it's showing the change in overall traffic in all the counties in California, right? And so even though the stay-at-home order was implemented on March 19, we can see as we move the dates, right, March 9, March 16, that, already March 16, even before the stay-at-home order was put in place, there had been very, very big changes in mobility of people, right? And then people really stopped moving in large quantities when they received the stay-at-home order. More than 100 countries have imposed travel restrictions because of coronavirus, right? So overall, the response in policy has mimicked the response in the media. It's been global, it's been strong. Even in the places where it hasn't been strong enough, it's been stronger than other policies for climate change. If you look at the contrast on states that have implemented carbon policies in the US, right? There's 10 Northeast states that have capped the power sector emissions. There's a cap and trade system in California. There's a Washington State's Clean Air Rule, which is still pending a court ruling. But nothing compared to the map I was showing you before, with every single or almost every single state implementing very strong policies for climate change. Same thing happens around the world, right? If you look at the legend here in this map, it looks like a lot of countries are implementing carbon pricing initiatives, but a lot of them are, scheduled for implementation. So the reaction in the policy is very different, right? And despite the initial skepticism, COVID-19 has become a central issue for the US government. There have been related daily press briefings that were canceled on April 27 because of some, outrage about comments from the president, but in general, it's been up front there in the main policies and the most important political issues. It's not been the same with climate change, right? So there's been denial, and one of the first things that President Trump did when he came into power was to notify that the U.S. would quit the Paris climate agreement. All right, so a few words about why saliency and policy reaction could be so different for these two crises. On one end, I told you a little bit about these public goods and externalities effects for climate change and for COVID-19. But this issue that the benefits are spread out around the world and the costs are local is even stronger for climate change, right? When you implement cap and trade policies, carbon pricing, and reduce the growth of your economy, you are benefiting everyone, but incurring in costs locally. It is difficult and costly, and in many cases not even feasible, to protect from the effects coming from the actions of other countries in terms of climate change, right? The effects are very global. For example, the polar caps melting from higher temperatures cannot be stopped by restricting travel or even restricting economic activity in Alaska, right? Or in the North Pole. You cannot do that because the effects are global. So that is one of the things that makes addressing climate change so difficult and costly, and so difficult to coordinate that, some countries have just said, it's too difficult, we're not doing anything about it. The other thing that is very difficult for climate change versus COVID-19 is that it has a lot more uncertainty in terms of its effects. The effects of climate change have more time and spatial variability. The extreme changes are much slower, and the transmission mechanism is less easily understood by the public, as well as the consequences. So again, in the face of all of this uncertainty, it becomes politically difficult to address it. So that is also a big difference between the two. How am I doing on time? All right. So those were a couple of thoughts about how COVID-19 and climate change are similar and how they're different. Now, is COVID-19 directly affecting climate change? I don't know if you've all seen this picture, along with many others, showing animals, resurfacing in cities. So even though this one happened to be a fake photo, because the dolphin that they talked about was not in Venice, as they were saying, it was still a dolphin in a port in Sardinia that, I have read, it's not a common occurrence even there, right? And it is true that in Venice, the cleaning of the canals that has been discussed is significant with the absence of tourists, right? We've seen in the case of the city of Luri in Northeast Bangkok, groups of monkeys going into town for food and causing damages, sometimes even as 1,000 monkeys in groups with causing a lot of damages. And the interpretation is the consequences, there are no tourists used to feed them, they're going hungry. There have been sights of boars in downtown Barcelona, wild goats in Wales, and wolves in San Francisco. Here's one right in front of the Golden Gate. But really, more than a benefit for animals from the alleged cleaning of the world, this shows a close connection of humans and animals, and how small changes in this relationship could affect their symbiotic relationship. So these pictures are entertaining. I wouldn't say that they mean they're creating a much better environment for animals. And more importantly, these are all very short-term effects. So in that sense, I think COVID-19 is not really affecting climate change through improving habitats. One way in which it is affecting it, at least in the short run, is in the effect it has in global CO2 emissions, right? This is common when we see decline of economic activity in general. This is showing the forecasted, right? The black line is showing you the actual growth, and the color lines are showing you the forecasted. So every time has been a big global financial crisis, like the Asian financial crisis or in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, emissions have grown lower than expected. And this is what we're seeing right now, right? So the final effect on the decline of the economy depends on the emissions intensity or carbon efficiency of the production. But with no changes in this efficiency, the Center for International Climate Research predicts a decline of between 0.3 and 1.2% in global emissions by the end of the year, right? So the little two dots at the end. That can be seen in the measurements of individual cities, right? These plots show strong declines of NO2 in San Francisco. This one shows similar for CO2 levels in San Francisco as well. Here we see NO2 emissions, nitrogen dioxide emissions for New York City, right? So again, they've been going down, basically because there's fewer people driving around and taking public transportation and consuming in a way, right? That's the connection with the economy. LA shows us the same pattern, right? And most of this pattern, most of the decline in emissions comes from the reduction in car usage, especially the duration of the trips. This is something that we have also looked at in our analysis of mobility data. And it is reflected, for example, in LA in increase in road speed, for example. That's one way of showing that there's definitely a decline in the car usage. The emissions from airline industry, right here on the bottom right, and from surface transportation, top right, are the ones that have been showing the largest decline, right? If we look at the impact of confinement on 2020 annual emissions, we see projections of around 4 to 7% compared to 2019. So 4 to 7% decline in the annual level of emissions. It's going to depend on the duration of the lockdown. If pre-pandemic conditions and mobility and economic activity return by mid-June, the decline would be around 4%. If some restrictions remain worldwide, then the predictions are around 7%. And these maps show the drop in emissions for different dates using data from a global carbon project, right? So as we move in the year, and you see the first are the Asian and then the European countries, and then you see declines in emissions in all of the world. And then as you know, the 21st of April, which is considered the peak of lockdown, as the lockdown measures are lifted, then you start going up, right? So there's been an unquestionable reduction in emissions. The question is how significant these are to stop climate change, right? And there's not so many studies about what would this mean in the long term. There's a few, right? So for example, this study by Bonilla and Carriazo in the city of Bogota, Colombia, look at the impact of a policy that they implemented more than a decade ago that looks at a day where people, regular weekday business day where people are not allowed to use their cars. What they find is that air quality is improved by 2% with reduction in emissions that are similar to those numbers. But that those benefits disappear within a couple of days. And in some cases, there's actually an overshoot of economic activity overcompensating that day. And so, it really doesn't make a difference in the long run. So no, climate change, COVID-19 is not solving climate change, even though, it's causing significant changes in the way we live. These are small. Researchers say the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air will rise to a record high level this month, actually. And this year, we've had the second warmest first quarter ever recorded, according to NOAA, right? So the reduction in activity in COVID-19 is not in the same orders of magnitude, and our capacity to overshoot once we remove the lockdown measures is vastly different now from previous years. The United Nations 2019 emission gap report calculates that avoiding warming of more than 1.5 degrees requires reduction of nearly 8% of emissions for the next decade. And if you remember when I told you about the forecast for this year, it was between 4 and 7%. So basically, we would require to have a similar level of reduction in emissions for 10 years than we've had in the worst possible scenario for this year with COVID-19. So I don't think this will solve the issue, right? Now, we've talked about the similarities and the differences, how it's directly affecting climate change. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was, so yeah, I think COVID-19 is not really either, affecting negatively or positively the levels of climate change or the issue of climate change in the short run, but is it going to affect our fight against climate change going into the future? And I think this is probably the most important question. And the answer I would give is probably, right? We have reasons to think that it might provide benefits and reasons to think it might provide disadvantages, right? So first, one of the ways in which we foresee that this crisis will have a negative impact on climate change is because it weakens the fight for density and public transportation. You've probably seen it in the news, people saying, of course, the problem began in Seattle and New York, not because these are very well-connected cities to the to foreign countries, but because they are very dense, right? So everyone is using public transportation, everyone is touching each other. What we need to do from now on is actually stop raising the requirements for density, stop promoting density in cities, because we need to prevent this from happening in the next pandemic. Well, when you actually look at the data, you see that it's more connectivity to sources of contagion that determine why the infections were earlier in these places, right? In fact, there's many places that are denser than New York that haven't shown those same levels of contagion and cases and growth in cases, right? So Seoul, for example, Seoul is 1.5 times as dense as New York City with 1.5 million more residents, yet it reports only 7.4 cases per 100,000 residents and 4 total deaths. Our current COVID-19 rate tops 2,200 cases per 100,000 inhabitants in New York. Same thing for Singapore, Hong Kong, and parts of Taiwan, places denser than New York that have been able to successfully pursue early testing and extensive tracing of coronavirus cases rather than widespread isolation. And actually, if you look at more recent data, the top 5 counties in the US with most viruses per capita are Trousdale, Tennessee, Lincoln, Arkansas, Dakota, Nebraska, Nobles, Minnesota, and Lake Tennessee, each home to fewer than 100,000 residents per square mile compared to New York's 25,000, right? So it is, and that's why I added that mistakenly right there, right? So it is the public's perception, but I believe it's mistaken. There are things related to density that could be relevant, but a couple of recent studies that have come out have shown that it's more in-house density, right? Congestion inside the house. A recent analysis by ProPublica for Illinois shows that in Chicago, low density areas like Englewood have fewer households per square mile than most other neighborhoods, but see very high infection rates. And when you plot them all, basically what you see is a negative relationship between the cases per 1,000 residents and density. However, when you look at the other side of the coin, which is crowding inside houses, you tend to see a quite convincing positive relationship, right? So blaming density is not only unhelpful for creating virus mitigation strategies, it has the potential to diminish our ability to recover by stoking unfounded fear of living in dense places. And why do I make such a fuss about density? Because density is directly connected to our ability to curtail emissions, right? Although there are policy and institutional factors, as you can see when you compare Perth and Detroit, for example, the relationship is negative between these two factors, right? And some people, instead of looking at these empirical reality, are saying things like, we should build cities in the countryside because the air is cleaner there. Of course, this is a joke by French comedian and sarcastic writer Alphonse Allais, but he was a comedian, but this is similar to what some policymakers are suggesting seriously, right? There's been innumerable studies. One that I really like is looking at all of French cities by Thea and co-authors in 2018, that shows that if you're concerned about fuel consumption and emissions, what you really need to address is density, right here in this red circle, and density of public transportation, right? So those are the two factors that show not only negative correlation with fuel consumption after controlling for multiple factors, but also after using instrumental variables show a causal impact on a reduction of fuel consumption. Just to give you a sense of their numbers, they find that choosing to live at the fringe of a metropolitan area instead of at its center, the mean sample household would bear an extra consumption of approximately 6 fuel tanks per year, and doubling residential density would result in an annual saving of approximately 2 tanks per household, right? This is not only the case in the US, it's not only the case in France. The relationship between fuel consumption and emissions per capita and density is negative, right? So attacking density because we mistakenly think it's the cause and the factor that makes coronavirus a big crisis in some places is, shooting ourselves in the foot in our ability to pursue a very important policy, which is density-related policies. I could go on and on about density and benefits of cities that we might be foregoing if we stop making these policies, but maybe we leave that for the final discussion. The other thing, so this I've only told you, negative things about what COVID-19 could do to our fight against climate change. But I think there's a couple of factors that we, still remain to be determined or confirmed. But I think there's two important factors that could make a difference, right? So one is that the telework could help reduce the usage of cars. We discussed already a reduction of movement of around 50%, right? However, not all that 50% in the reduction of movement is people who stop working, right? There's not a proportionate decline in economic activity. The difference between these two numbers is explained by telework. Although telework shows significant differences between occupations and income levels, the pandemic saw a strong increase in the people working from home. In 2019, this number was only 19% of workers. And during the pandemic, this, depending on the location, went up to 40% or more, depending on the location and in the income distribution. Recent work by Jonathan Dingle and Bert Neyman find that 30% of the jobs in the United States can be performed directly at home, with significant variation across states and industries. So what these two graphs and those numbers tell you is two things, right? Even in normal situations, we could be having 37% of the jobs doing telework, and we only have 19%, right? So more people could be working from home. During the pandemic, we have more than that 37% of occupations determined as potentially teleworkable. What does that mean? Well, that people have made significant changes. They have reinvented the way they work, and they have made their works teleworkable, right? I don't suggest that we remain in lockdown for the foreseeable future or even for in the long run. But what I'm saying is maybe firms are learning something about teleworkability for some occupations and some work, and maybe some of these could curtail some of the emissions through reducing the amount of people who need to commute. And commuting is not pleasant. It's been growing and growing since 1980. And even though the average one-way commuting time is 27 minutes, which is long compared to other countries, if you look at individual cities, you see even larger numbers. Like Washington, D.C., where I'm living, has an average commute of 43 minutes. New York, 35 minutes. Maryland, 30 minutes, right? That, just the median, the mean, the small number, which is around 27 minutes, corresponds to nearly 9 days per year. So I don't think that a lot of people would be so upset to see these commutes reduced, even by going to work a couple of times a week instead of every day, or completely switching to telework, right? So just to qualify this maybe idea is, we see the negative impact on the policies aimed towards density, but maybe the increase in sprawl could partially be offset by increasing in telework. by increasing telework. And also, finally, this is something that might also be a little optimistic, but I think it's good to end the lecture with an optimistic note, is there might be an improved perception of the government role in reducing intensity of crisis. You know, there are differences in opinions about the way the government has approached the crisis, but there is no doubt that people and firms turn to governments as their main source of guidance and protection in this COVID-19 crisis. This has highlighted the importance of government in preventing the intensity of crisis. And maybe this could also be a benefit in the perception that government could take strong actions towards curbing climate change. The discussion has largely centered around the preparedness before crisis for COVID-19. And maybe the realization that there needs to be prevention and international coordination could also be useful to address climate change. And so thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. I have a couple of interesting questions. So from Mitchell, some climate control supporters have wanted people to reduce their air and ground travel to save the environment. Now that COVID-19 has effectively done that, has it made any significant impact? So that's a good question. And that's something that I've spent the last couple of weeks looking into in the numbers. And my conclusion, and I think I said that in the talk, is it hasn't, right? It has, if you look at the number, it has had a very significant impact on the emissions, specifically through the two factors you're mentioning, air and ground travel. However, it hasn't really stopped the trend. Of course, we would have to see what happens going into the future, but if we judge from small experiments we've seen in the world, and just in general, things like, there's a very interesting story about what was called the Little Ice Age, which happened between 1300s and the 1800s. And researchers say that this could be affected by the killings of millions of people who performed agriculture and cattle raising in the Americas from the Europeans coming here. And that was a great change in the use of land and the production of emissions at the time. And even that resulted in a change of 0.014 degrees. So I guess the short answer is it's making a difference, but it would have to be much more significant and much more sustained to actually curtail irreversible climate change. And it's so costly to do it this way that probably is not the way we want to do it. All right, from Ryan. Telework seems to have impacted automotive emissions, but what role will the resumption of normal air traffic play as states and countries open up? Yes, Ryan, it's same thing that I mentioned before, right? It is an opportunity to change the way we do things significantly, but it's not enough to change it for 3, 4, or 5 months. So if telework changes automotive emissions, it would be a significant change. It's not going to necessarily change, air traffic. It might reduce it if we reduce the number of business travels we have. But I think, telework could have a strong impact. From Viola. There's another question here. Is there any information on what is the influence of climate change and the emergence of viruses or health risk with regards to new viruses? Yeah, I didn't touch on that, but there's some recent research that looks at the cross-sectional variation in contagion rates, morbidity, and mortality rates across cities with different levels of pollution. And apparently, what they find is that the air quality, which is very closely associated with emissions, even though climate change goes way beyond just air quality, but it's closely connected, there's a higher morbidity and mortality in places with lower air quality because it is a respiratory virus. Maybe you're thinking about other respiratory viruses. If you're thinking about, in general, viruses that are coming from wild animals and contact with wild animals, well, deforestation has also played a large role in both accelerating climate change and moving wild animals that could transmit diseases closer to humans. So from Viola, why is GDP impact so much worse in the South? So I'm assuming you mean the South of the US, not the South of the world, right? And the GDP impact is much bigger in the South because their exposure to the Gulf, their exposure to climate change related disasters like hurricanes and flooding. Basically, it's their connection to, if you see the numbers of GDP losses are also big, for example, in counties in New York State, right? So being close to the sea, which is going to see big rises, is going to, you're going to see a lot of your infrastructure destroyed unless you really adapt to it. So that's the difference. Martha has a question, says, during the pandemic, we've seen a tension between economic and public health concerns. Is there a similar tension in the debate over the global impact of climate change and how people respond to it? 100%. That is the driving force between disagreements. There are really no big disagreements in the way, scientists suggest people should address the issue of climate change. There are some disagreements in how COVID-19 should be addressed, but in general, in both cases, we have very good frameworks that could tell apart a good policy from a bad policy. However, there is, of course, a strong tension with economic growth. And I think it's a valid question. I think we should give priority to saving lives in the COVID-19 and also in climate change. But I also understand that, we need to think about the short run and the long run in both cases. So there's a big tension. What I believe the public and even the policymakers have not really acknowledged well is that, especially for climate change, the investments and the change in policies that we make now are going to have exponential impact in the future. And so I think for climate change, we're giving priority to economic growth in the short run and sacrificing very strongly, especially in some locations that will be very strongly affected, not only life, but the economic growth in the future. There's the question here from Debbie. Why do economic arguments about the cost of climate change typically fall short in moving people to action? That's a good question, right? That goes back to the publicist analogy, right? Why aren't more people reacting to climate change? And in my work studying climate change and teaching about it, I think there's the couple of things that I mentioned, right? One is the saliency and the uncertainty of climate change. You've seen people talk about it in a joking way when you have a cold day in the winter. They talk about global warming, but it is cold. Because this is something about, this is a problem of probabilities. This is a problem of long-term trends. This is a problem of looking at temperature going up in a sustained way for years, right? So it's something that for us is hard to fathom because we live day to day. Whereas, the virus, you see things happening in a very short time scope. And so, it's easier to react to that. The other thing is the issue of externalities and public goods. I think it was almost impossible to really delve deeply into this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But this idea that we need coordinated action around the world to address climate change, and that the benefits from addressing this are going to be spread out around the world, but that the costs are local, I think are one of the main things that make climate change so difficult to address. You need to convince very highly polluting countries and high emission countries like China, like Australia, like the US, that they need to slow down their economic activity or make huge investments in making it of a different nature. because, you know, they're going to be affecting islands in the Caribbean, right? Or the Southeast Pacific. And it's difficult to convince that because of the discrepancy between benefits and costs. From Harris, how long would we need to adopt a COVID level behavior change to see long-term climate impacts? That's a good question. And the answer is 10 years. No, the answer would be 6 months of every year during the next 10 years, right? So we saw that the forecasts of the impact of COVID-19 on emissions worldwide goes from 4% to 7% approximately. It depends on whether economic activity completely resumes by June or whether there are restrictions in place. So my guess, it's going to be something between 4 and 7. And what the UN study says is that to be able to prevent from going into the levels of 2% increase in annual temperatures, which is the threshold considered to be reversible, we would need the decline in emissions of 8% annually, right? So, you know, for a decade. So basically we need COVID-19 for a decade, where COVID-19 in our case means, you know, completely stopping the world for a couple of months or 3 months in a year and then reducing activities. So I think it's untenable that way. I think we need to really change the way we produce services and goods. We need to transition our economy to make the changes that are needed. It is not enough to just stop it. It would be enough to stop it enough, but it wouldn't be tenable because of the economic impact this has. Okay, I think I have time for a couple more. From Taylor, why are climate change and COVID such politically polarizing issues, whereas other scientific matters less so? That's a great question. I think it's because of this issue of uncertainty, both in geographical disparity of the effect and time horizon. And so people weaponize this uncertainty to get short-term returns, because climate change is so strictly connected to, or the policies that could be implemented to slow down climate change are so strongly connected to economic activity. You know, people don't want to give up what they're doing. Think about a mining town or a town or a region focused on coal. They don't want to give up their livelihood to possibly prevent some floods in the next 80 years in Louisiana, right? So there's one thing, which is this disconnect between the impacts and where the costs and the change needs to come from, that, you know, it just makes it difficult for these two separate entities to coordinate. There are no incentives to coordinate. And then the other side, just the uncertainty and how complex it is to really understand, you know, how could it be that we have global warming, we have both, you know, a higher incidence of hurricanes and tornadoes, floods, and at the same time, you know, warmer summers, and in some cases, colder winters. Like, we really need to understand that the Earth is a very complex system to address this. And this is very difficult for a politician to communicate. It's easier to say, you know, these other guys want to get rid of your jobs. So, you know, we need to, that's why I think this could be an opportunity for people to say, you know, we need to be prepared for crisis, because when the time comes, if we're not prepared, it could get really bad. And then you can look at the world, how countries that were prepared for this and those that were not, you know, how the results were starkly different. Brendan has a question, I think. What are your thoughts on the relative impact from the climate change efforts in the business sector to combat climate change compared to that of government? You know, I teach in a business school and I teach to business students, and I keep telling them that, you know, if we could come up with changes that are good for business and the climate, then we're done, right? I think one area in which this could be possible is, and I teach to real estate students, in construction of buildings, where energy efficiency is reflected not only in reduction in costs, but it's capitalized in higher rents and prices. So in that case, I think that's an area where, you know, we could leave the private sector take initiative in a way. In other cases, I think it has to be the government, because this really requires coordination that goes beyond the private sector. All right, so Hannah's telling me it's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching this. I think this is a great initiative. You know, stay safe at home, and you know, we'll be publishing a couple of studies related to COVID-19, the impact on the economy and the impact on health. So, you know, be on the lookout for those, where we're going to analyze issues like this one.